Thank you, Jacob, for resisting the temptation to tell stories about me. I appreciate that. And thank you all for being here for this few weeks after Constitution Day talk. Even though it was unintentional, I wanted to mention that I love the symbolism of having a Constitution Day talk a little bit after Constitution Day for a couple of reasons. One is that from a historical perspective, we know, of course, that the debate and discussion over the Constitution only just began after the signing of the Constitution on September 17th, 1787. In fact, it was after Constitution Day, after the delegates to the convention had signed the Constitution, that we got the pamphlet wars over ratification, which gave us, for instance, the Federalist Papers. And the first Federalist paper was not published until the end of October in 1787. So to have a Constitution Day event in October is, I think, historically meaningful in that sense. And it's also symbolically meaningful in another sense, I think, which is that especially in our own time, we should not limit ourselves to thinking about and talking about the Constitution to just one day or week of the year. So we should continue these discussions at all times. So this afternoon, I'm going to talk to you about something that generally peaks in prominence every 4 years in the United States. Maybe you could say every 2 years in a less significant sense. And that phenomenon, in my judgment, is rather consequential for our constitutional order. Now, you probably know where I'm going with this because it's in the title of my talk, but it would be reasonable for you to think that I was talking about presidential and or midterm elections. But what I actually have in mind is how we talk about and think about the significance of those elections. I have in mind how we interpret elections, how we debate about what the consequences of elections should be. Specifically, I have in mind what I call mandate talk. And the title of my talk, Let's Talk About Mandates, is meant to be a bit playful because I think we need to talk about the idea of electoral mandates as a political concept in relationship to the American Constitution, because I think we as Americans tend to talk about mandates too much, or we talk about them in an ill-advised way, or we talk about them without a sufficient constitutional backdrop to our thinking. So I'm not planning to discuss, say, what mandates I think President Trump does or does not have from the American people right now in the wake of the 2024 election. Instead, I'm hoping that we can have a different sort of discussion of electoral mandates today. So what is mandate talk? What do I mean by mandate talk? What do I mean by an electoral mandate? So as I understand it, an electoral mandate refers to claims that the outcome of an election has granted to the president or to the triumphant political party the authorization to do certain things in office, to pass certain policies, to take certain executive actions, or to engage in certain behaviors. So to put that differently, a mandate claim suggests that elected officials have not only the political power they're in office, but they have not only that political power, but also the democratic legitimacy and therefore what we could call the moral authority to implement their agenda. A mandate claim indicates that an election has revealed or conveyed the will of the American people with respect to certain policies that we would like to see implemented, policy issues or areas that we would like to see prioritized, or political principles that we would like to see followed. So scholars have defined mandates as well as claims that the people have effectively given authoritative commands to their elected officials, that they have given the winning candidates or the winning party the right to push forward with an agenda, and that the minority party and its members, those who have lost the most recent election, have a duty to defer to the victors to implement their policy priorities. So as such, we can think of electoral mandates as an interpretive concept for understanding the significance of election results. Perhaps more importantly, though, or just as importantly, we can also think of the concept of electoral mandates as a rhetorical device for public officials and pundits to attempt to persuade others what the agenda should be in Washington, D.C., and how that agenda should be carried out. Thus, in American politics, it has become the standard for mandate talk to become prominent after every election, virtually every major election, as both sides grapple over what the most recent election means and whether anyone received a mandate to govern in certain ways. Mandates are sometimes especially associated with landslide elections because they seem to carry the clearest or the most significant mandate when someone wins with an overwhelming margin. But in some ways, mandates are even more appealing to political leaders who barely prevailed in the most recent election because they are looking for kind of ways to facilitate their agenda to get things done. And mandate claims are a way of attempting to get things done quickly, while members of the losing party are still reeling from their loss before they've started to regain their confidence because they know another election is right around the corner. A mandate claim is an attempt to, we should do these things now because the people want us to do these things, and you should not stand in the way. In the meantime, those on the losing side attempt to argue back, no, you didn't receive a mandate to do this. That wasn't what the election was about. That's not what the people were saying. And they thereby attempt to minimize the policy consequences of their loss. Now, the prominence of mandate talk usually fades as elections appear further and further away in the rearview mirror, but the implicit logic and rhetorical echoes of mandates continue even then. So public officials, and you can nod along if you've heard anything along these lines, public officials might say something like, the American people have spoken on an issue. They might remind their audience that elections have consequences. They might say that they are merely doing what the American people sent me here to do. You might hear that this is what the voters voted for, or you might hear that this is what I ran on during my campaign and then the people elected me. These statements may not always be identical to mandate claims, but they are closely related, and mandate claims are often implicit within them. Now, at the outset of our examination of mandates, I want to acknowledge that they resonate deeply with us as Americans for a very good reason. A mandate claim is, after all, an appeal to the sovereignty of the people. It thus has an affinity with the first words of the preamble to the Constitution, we the people. Elections should have consequences. Elections are the means by which the American people are represented, and elections are the means by which the American people hold elected officials accountable. As Madison puts it in Federalist Number 51, a dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control on the government. We often overlook that line in Federalist 51 because Federalist 51 is famously about the separation of powers, where Madison makes the case that a dependence on the people is not enough. We need institutional measures, auxiliary precautions in addition to elections. But he says, even in making the case for the importance of the separation of powers, a dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control on the government. So if there were no meaningful, discernible connection between the outcomes of elections on the one hand and the actions and policies of the government on the other, we would have good reason, I think, to doubt or to question whether we are truly living under a system of self-government. So mandate talk has good credentials insofar as it is in keeping with this fundamental commitment of our civic tradition. And that's no doubt one of the main reasons why both voters and leaders alike seem to find the concept of mandates so attractive. However, in various ways, in principle and in practice, I'm going to suggest that mandate talk is in tension with, or at the very least has the potential to be in tension with, other key features of our constitutional order and the American founders' vision for it. So I'm going to consult especially the thought, you'll hear James Madison's name more than anyone else in the rest of my talk, and I'm going to focus mostly on his thought during the 1780s when he was most intensively engaged in thinking about constitutional design. And my aim is to show that It's important that we think carefully about if and how we talk about mandates, and more generally about how we think about the consequences of elections within our constitutional system. But before I do that, before we dig into constitutional concerns, I want to first set the table with some skepticism of the descriptive persuasiveness of many assertions of mandates when political leaders say that they have a mandate to do X, Y, or Z. So scholars often call into question, and I think reasonably so, whether particular mandate claims hold up to empirical scrutiny. And when elected officials claim to speak on behalf of we the people, we should keep in mind that there's plenty of reason to question whether they're really doing so. First, I think we should recognize that mandate claims are often self-serving. It's much less common, at least at the outset of a conversation about mandates, it's much less common for someone to invoke a mandate to justify or explain some action that they would prefer not to take, or an action that they would prefer not to take. And in the cases when they do so, if you hear someone saying, I don't want to pass this law, don't want to pass this bill, but I think there was a mandate from the people to do so, that would likely be due to the fact that someone else, in a more self-serving way, had already convinced them that a mandate exists. For when an appeal to an alleged mandate is made, the argument is generally that the American people just happen to share the political opinions and positions of the mandate claimer. Like, what a surprise. How convenient. The American people would like me to do exactly what I as a politician would like to do anyways. Like, what a happy day, what a happy coincidence for me, your leader, that you all want me to do what I believe in and what I think is good and right. So, for that reason alone, mandate claims are worthy of scrutiny. Secondly, though, elections are complicated phenomena, and they are blunt instruments for communicating the American people's desires and opinions. So this is especially the case with respect to presidential elections, when you think about it. Every concern that millions of voters have all across the country must be boiled down to electing one person out of just two competitive alternatives. Now, this does not mean that it is necessarily impossible through careful data collection and analysis to discriminate between more and less persuasive mandate claims. Many analysts of public opinion data put a lot of effort into trying to figure that out. But the answers to what, if any, mandates exist are much more debatable and much harder to figure out than public officials and commentators often let on. So to see what I mean, one day when you have a lot of free time on your hands, and I hear that that is not right now, or at least it's not for the next couple of weeks, maybe on fall break, maybe you'll have some free time to do this on fall break, you should try to jot down every reason that you can imagine, realistically speaking. I guess you could also throw in some far-fetched ideas as well, but more importantly, realistic reasons that someone may have voted for a presidential candidate in a recent presidential election of your choice. Preferably, you should choose a victorious candidate, since we're talking about the mandates that presidents themselves claim. So when you're going through this exercise, you should keep in mind that some voters will have a very complicated policy-based rationale for voting for one candidate over the other, tallying up all of the pros and cons of each candidate's positions, from economic policy to social issues to foreign policy. Other voters will ultimately make their choice on the basis of a single issue and the positions of the candidates on that single issue. Political scientists creatively and cleverly call these voters single-issue voters. And so when you think about single-issue voters in the context of electoral mandates, these voters really at most could deliver a mandate only on the one issue that matters to them. So they're voting for a candidate that stands for dozens of policy positions on all sorts of policy issues, but what really mattered to those single-issue voters was where they stood on one issue. So it seems unreasonable to say that they gave the winning candidate a mandate on anything except maybe the one issue that determined their vote. Other voters will make their choices based on general judgments about the state of the nation. Is the country on the wrong track? Is the economy in rough shape? So these voters convey support for a general change of course from the incumbents if they believe the country's on the wrong track If they believe the economy is in rough shape, this is setting them up to support a challenger over the incumbent. And they convey support for a general change of course from the incumbent's administration. But it's hard to say that they deliver a more specific policy mandate than that. And then still others will vote on value judgments that are not explicitly tied to policy. So they may vote on the trustworthiness, the competence, the experience of the candidates, for instance. Okay, so once you have recorded all the reasons that you can imagine why someone voted for a certain candidate or party, then you should have a separate section of your notes, which lists all the ways in which voters may have disagreed with or disliked the candidate that they voted for. So there's no rule, even if some parts of our public discourse suggest this. There's no rule that you have to endorse everything that someone stands for just because you voted for them. And we know that voters choose candidates on the basis of what is called lesser of two evils reasoning. And that ubiquitous turn of phrase is all over the place whenever there's an election. Lesser of two evils, I think, is revealing with respect to mandate claims. The lesser of two evils framing implies that many people are voting for someone more to stop the bad things that they think their opponent would do if elected, rather to endorse any actions as good that their marginally preferred candidate might want to accomplish. So in this sense, such voters would seem to be delivering at most a negative policy mandate. Don't do these things, rather than a positive authorization to pass certain laws or to pursue certain policies. And if a voter disagrees with, say, just pick any issue out of a hat, say someone's tax policy, but votes for them anyways, it seems untenable for us to say that that voter has contributed to a policy mandate on the issue of taxation. Like they decided to table that issue to vote on the basis of things more important, but they actually may oppose the candidate they supported on that specific issue. So once you've brainstormed all the reasons that someone may vote for a presidential candidate and all of the concerns they may table in order to do so, then you have to ask yourself, how many voters shared each of these very complex voting metrics? They cared about these issues this much. They cared about these other issues that they disagreed with the candidate they voted for on. How many voters shared each distinct voting calculus? And now, at this point, when you've fallen behind enough on studying, because you've been doing this exercise, you should ask yourself, what exactly did the American people as a whole vote for in a given election? Did they deliver a mandate, and what did that mandate consist of? And I think you're often likely to wind up with more question marks than bright answers of they voted for this, the president should do this, Congress should do this, because the American people clearly voted for it. So for this reason, we should not be too easily convinced that any public figure is really speaking on behalf of the will of the American people when they say so. And that should make us skeptical of mandate claims. And that should concern us, because a successful but ultimately unwarranted mandate claim could have the effect of bringing about results in the name of we the people that do not necessarily really reflect the American people's collective judgment. Okay, so that's why I think as an empirical claim about what the American people are doing in an election, we should be skeptical of mandate claims. But now let's talk about some reasons to have constitutional concerns about mandate claims. And we should begin with a general overarching one that when I say it, it may seem so obvious to you as to not be worth mentioning, but I hope that it is. So the government's responsibility or accountability to the American people through elections is a core commitment of the American civic tradition. But of course, it's not the only core commitment of that tradition. We have also committed ourselves to the principle of limited constitutional government. And in fact, constitutionalism, rightly understood, is intended to be a way of securing the people's authority over their government by putting limits on the government and structuring it in certain ways. Thus, when a public figure makes a mandate claim that the people elected him or her to do something, we should be careful to make sure that the mandate claims rhetorical force, which is derived from our commitment to popular government by the people, that does not run afoul of our commitment to limited constitutional government. For the founders made clear that the most important manifestation of the sovereignty of the people was the ratification of the Constitution. Through that ratification, the American people gave public officials a list of authoritative directives that cannot be overridden by ordinary elections. The framers and the people who ratified the Constitution determined that these provisions were so vitally important that they did not want them to be subject to being overturned by some wind of passion or sentiment that would take over in any given election. Through the Constitution, the people bound themselves, as well as their representatives and other public officials, to be faithful to all constitutional provisions unless and until those provisions are amended. And as James Madison notes in Federalist 49, we probably don't want to consider rewriting or revising our Constitution too often. Federalist 49, I believe, has one of the great turns of phrase in the Federalist of constitutional conventions are of too ticklish a nature to go through with them very often. Now, by swearing an oath to the Constitution, elected officials sign up for a series of what we may call, now here's a sense in which I'm okay with mandates, what we may call constitutional mandates. I think that's a really key concept to juxtapose with the idea of electoral mandates. A constitutional mandate obligates public officials to abide by certain limitations and constraints in the Constitution, regardless of what those officials may think or even know the American people want or would like from them in the moment. From the perspective of constitutionalism, it doesn't matter if an election seems to reveal the American people's desire to violate or ignore or reinterpret any part of the Constitution. By their own choosing, their own self-limitation, their own self-restraint, the American people have established that any such expression of their will ought to be deemed constitutionally illegitimate. They've given themselves a constitutional means by which to express a will incompatible with the current Constitution. We call it the amendment process. The people want something that's incompatible with the Constitution. Well, the Constitution can be amended by the people. But outside of the amendment process, they've deprived themselves of any other means by which to empower their rulers to do something that the Constitution does not permit. And they did this not because they preferred an undemocratic or an unrepublican system, but because they recognized that all things considered, in their judgment, it is better to live under a system of constitutionalism that binds people and rulers alike with certain limitations. Now, of course, if you're thinking, when does a public official ever say, the people want me to violate the Constitution? They don't say that. They know not to say that. If pressed, they usually will make the case that a correct understanding of the Constitution allows them to do what they want to do and what the people want them to do. But when it comes to mandate talk, here's what I think we should be on guard against. Mandate claims incline us to ask first, did the American people actually vote for this? In this context, that's the question of mandate talk. Did the American people actually vote for this? Constitutionalism, I think, urges us that our first question should be, did the American people authorize this in the Constitution? So rather than did the American people vote for this in the last election, the question is, did the American people authorize this through the Constitution? And whatever they may seem to want out of their elected officials today, the ratification of the Constitution reflects the American people have chosen fidelity to the Constitution over other political aspirations. There's one specific way in which I want to hone in on this, how constitutional limits may come into conflict with mandate claims as a practical matter, and that has to do with federalism. One way of describing our system of federalism is that our foundational document, the Constitution, constitutes us as members of multiple political communities simultaneously. So yes, we the people of the United States, but we are also the people of our respective states, Virginians and Tennesseans and so forth. Now, through the Constitution, the people of the United States, that community of which we are a part, through the federal government, they are authorized to exercise what Madison calls in Federalist 45 few and defined powers. In contrast, the people of Virginia, the people of Tennessee, the people of all the states through their state governments are authorized to exercise what Madison calls numerous and indefinite powers. In other words, we act in our capacity as the American people in certain political respects and for certain political purposes. But we are the people of our individual states for other political respects and for other political purposes. When you say you are Virginian, I don't know how many of you are Virginians, but I'm in Virginia, so I'm going to say when you say you are Virginians. When you say that you are a Virginian, you're not merely saying that you are an American who lives within a certain geographical area of the country. Instead, you're saying that you are not only a member of the American political community, you are also a citizen of a state-level political community, the Commonwealth of Virginia. So in my life, I've lived in Kentucky, Tennessee, Indiana, and Arizona. So I'm well aware that our state-centric cultures and identities are not what the founders were familiar with, that we do not have that kind of state-centric culture and identity anymore. But nevertheless, under the supreme law of the land, we are still constituted as one American people for limited political purposes and as the people of our states for all other purposes. And for those of you who have studied the founding, you've studied the American Constitution, this will be familiar to you, but this has key benefits. At least aspirationally, it has 4 key benefits. That by constituting 2 levels of government, each sovereign in its own sphere, and each checking the other, Madison says in Federalist 51 that a double security arises to the rights of the people, that federalism and the separation of powers combined create protection for liberty. Secondly, the American system of federalism empowers the federal government to pass national policies on those matters that truly call for national policy, while allowing the state governments to tailor policies to the distinctive needs and desires of their people on all other matters. Third, federalism empowers Americans to vote with their feet, choosing where to live in a sort of marketplace of republics. And fourth, by allowing the people of the different states to come up with their own policy answers to various policy questions, federalism keeps us from having to settle every policy debate through a grand conflict at the national level. But all of this, all of those benefits, hinge on the fact that the American people, through the Constitution, limited issues on which they, the American people as a whole, are the relevant constituency. For all issues, as the 10th Amendment puts it, for all issues reserved to the states, the will of the American people as a whole is constitutionally inoperative. Again, the American people reserve the right to amend the Constitution, which could alter the balance or the distribution of power between the federal government and the state governments. And the American people have done that, in fact, in very significant ways. For instance, most significantly through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments after the Civil War. And it should also be noted, acknowledged, admitted that when there's a disagreement between the state governments and the federal government, who gets to decide an institution of the federal government, the federal judiciary. But even though that is the case, the American people have still constitutionally determined to leave many decisions to our state-level communities. So here then, I think, is another respect in which we should be on guard about mandate talk and the echoes of mandate talk. Mandate talk often seems to be based on an unstated assumption that if the American people would like the president or the Congress to address some pressing concern, then the federal government thereby is justified in addressing that concern. But that's not really the constitutional framework of federalism. So thinking in terms of mandates, that may again lead us to ask the wrong question first. It may incline us to ask, through the last election, did the American people make clear that they want the federal government to deal with this issue? But on the framework of constitutionalism, and specifically I have in mind Madison's constitutionalism, our first question should instead be, did the American people authorize the federal government to deal with this issue in the Constitution, or did the American people reserve this issue to the state-level political communities of which we all are a part? Okay. A third way in which I think mandate talk has the potential to lead us constitutionally astray is in distorting our conception of the nature and purpose of our representative system. Mandate talk sometimes takes the form of implying that American voters have given authoritative instructions to their representatives. The voters have told you what to do. Your job is to do it. But constitutional framers like Madison had a different, more elevated, and I think more nuanced model of representation. So many of you have probably encountered Federalist 10. How many, show of hands, how many of you read Federalist 10? A few of you, a handful of you. Madison's famous essay about the extended republic. That essay is renowned mostly for Madison's argument that by extending the sphere of Republican government, you take in more diverse interests and opinions, and thus, in a large republic, it's less likely that there will be a majority faction that's able to control the federal government. But in that essay, Madison also makes a striking claim about the benefits of representation. He writes that the effect of representation is, quote, to refine and enlarge the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens whose wisdom may best discern the true interest of their country and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations. Under such a regulation, Madison continues, it may well happen that the public voice pronounced by the representatives of the people will be more consonant to the public good than if pronounced by the people themselves, convened for the purpose. Madison has in mind here in Federalist 10, first and foremost, the House of Representatives, the federal institution that is most in touch with the people, most reflective of the people, most accountable to the people. Yet even in the case of the House, Madison's job description for a representative is emphatically not to embrace just whatever the views of your constituents are. Instead, the job of a representative is to filter the public's views. A representative is still supposed to pronounce the public voice, but we might say, in a way that probably wouldn't make much sense to Madison, that there's a lot of audio editing that is supposed to take place. If the duty of Congress was simply to carry out the policy mandates expressed in the most recent election, we would arguably be operating under a very different model of representation. And Madison's vision for representation is even more provocative for us, I think, in the case of the Senate. The Senate is not only built to have officials with more experience, knowledge, and wisdom than the members of the House of Representatives. With the Senate's 6-year terms and staggered elections, it's also built for senators to be able to resist or wait out temporary impulses and passions that the people might have when, in the judgment of the senators, those passions or impulses are misguided. So this is a long quote from Madison, but I think it makes the point well in Federalist 63. He says that the Senate can be, quote, a defense to the people against their own temporary errors and delusions, as the cool and deliberate sense of the community ought in all governments, and actually will in all free governments, ultimately prevail over the views of its rulers. So there are particular moments in public affairs when the people, stimulated by some irregular passion or some illicit advantage, or misled by the artful misrepresentations of interested men, may call for measures which they themselves will afterwards be the most ready to lament and condemn. In these critical moments, how salutary will be the interference of some temperate and respectable body of citizens in order to check the misguided career and to suspend the blow meditated by the people against themselves until reason, justice, and truth can regain their authority over the public mind, end quote. On this view, it seems to me that one of the Madisonian roles of senators is to limit, to moderate, or to refine the policy impact of certain elections, at least in some cases. Now, it's essential, I think, to highlight that Madison does affirm that the cool and deliberate sense of the community ought to prevail. That's what makes Republican government Republican, that the cool and deliberate sense of the community controls the direction of the government. But unlike what mandate claims may seem to suggest, the cool and deliberate sense of the community is something that might need to be transmitted over a course of time and over a series of elections, not just in one electoral moment. Any individual election cycle might not embody the cool and deliberate sense of the American people. It might embody something else. And it's the job of senators, on Madison's view, to make that judgment call. What is reflected in the most recent election, and to act accordingly as they understand their responsibility as senators. Now here I'm going to bring in Hamilton, because Hamilton makes a point about the president similar to what Madison says about the Senate. In Federalist 71, Hamilton acknowledges that, quote, the Republican principle demands that the deliberate sense of the community should govern the conduct of those to whom they entrust the management of their affairs. But it does not require an unqualified complacence to every sudden breeze of passion, or to every transient impulse which the people may receive from the arts of men who flatter their prejudices to betray their interests, end quote. So this may entail then that a president should not overread, this is just an example, should not overread the significance of a midterm election. The president is in office for 4 years, a midterm election happens halfway through. A president's job is not to bend over backwards to whatever the midterm election seems to be suggesting, but to think carefully about what their duty as president is to serve the good of the people. So once again, we should take note of how mandate talk and Madisonian constitutionalism pushes us in the direction of asking different first questions. Mandate talk tends to lead us to ask, did the last election demonstrate that the American people currently want X, Y, or Z? But the perspective of Madison's constitutional thought leads us to ask first, what, if anything, did the last election tell us about the cool and deliberate sense of the American people, as opposed to temporary, unsettled opinions or impulses that they might have? And the answer to this question for Madison should determine how elected officials understand their duty in light of the most recent election results. Okay, finally, Madison's constitutional thought not only draws a distinction between the cool and deliberate sense of the people on the one hand and the transient impulses of the people on the other. Through the separation of powers, the American people are directed, they're channeled to convey their cool and deliberate sense in very different ways, in ways, as Madison would put it, as different as Republican principles will well admit. The House, the Senate, and the presidency are elected by different groupings of the American people. They are elected on different time frames. They are elected through different methods. And all of this means that the Constitution avoids any single expression, any single pronouncement, any single channeling of the people's will. So we may be tempted to think that presidential elections are the one most important expression of the American people's will. And as an illustration of this perspective, Woodrow Wilson pointed out that the president is the only party nominee for whom the whole nation votes. Wilson highlighted that no one else represents the people as a whole, exercising a national choice. The voice of the president, Wilson said, is the only truly national voice in affairs. And according to Wilson, it seems that another title for the president could be the only spokesperson of the whole people. However, even if the president is uniquely selected and uniquely situated in American politics, the Constitution does not give the president a special claim to speak on behalf of the people. In fact, arguably, the Constitution does not establish the president as a representative figure at all. And there's good reason to doubt that a single human being could, in any meaningful sense, represent an entire nation. In contrast, Congress is the aggregate of hundreds of partial reflections of the American people. So that understanding of how the American people are represented or reflected in our government is very messy and complex. Mandate claims attempt to simplify things for us. Mandate claims attempt to simplify the message of an election, the meaning of an election. They present the American people as speaking in one unified voice. But in this sense, Madison's constitutionalism seeks to acknowledge complexity and to keep things complicated, to not try to oversimplify for us, but to keep things complicated. On Madison's view, the Constitution was intentionally designed to force the American people to speak many times by different means and different groupings, to raise their voices in different ways. And it was designed in this way to reap the benefits of the separation of powers in what Madison calls in Federalist 39 a strictly Republican system, something that had never before been accomplished, a separation of powers system on strictly Republican terms. Because Madison looked to Montesquieu for insight into the separation of powers, and Montesquieu had looked to the English Constitution, and at the time of the founding, the English Constitution was the example par excellence of how you'd set up the separation of powers. But it had, of course, for Americans, one huge drawback. And that drawback was that it was not a Republican system. It was a mixed system consisting of democratic, aristocratic, and monarchical elements. But that huge disadvantage was also England's great advantage over America, because Montesquieu argued, and Madison knew from Montesquieu, that the separate social orders in England reinforced the separation of powers, that they sustained the separation of powers over time. So in the Republican United States, the framers would have to build a separation of powers system that could somehow be sustainable without resting on separate social orders, without resting on an aristocracy, without resting on a hereditary monarchy. And an important part of the solution was to build the branches so differently that they would have different interests and characteristics. The separation of powers thus translates the American people's will through different mechanisms to make the different branches respond to the American people in different ways. And if it's working as it's planned, that should support checking and balancing of the different branches by creating friction between them with their differing and complicated relationships to the American people. And in addition to bolstering the separation of powers, this constitutional arrangement also protects against the power and possibility of majority factions. So in Madison's thought, I already mentioned Federalist 10, the extended republic with its diversity would be primarily responsible for preventing the existence or the success of majority factions. And for Madison, the fact that national elections would be such complicated affairs was part of their appeal. With so many diverse interests at play, no majority faction is likely to exist. If it does exist, it's still not likely to be successful in taking the reins of the government, because our multiplicity of elections just creates so many barriers to one faction gaining dominance. One way of understanding mandate talk is that it is tailored to overcome what are seen as the drawbacks of the separation of powers. The slowness, the unpleasant negotiations and compromises, the gridlock. Mandate talk seems like it's a way to surmount these challenges by locating and announcing a discernible, coherent, unified expression of the people's voice to tell everyone in the government, get in line, push in the same direction, stop getting in the way of what the people want. But Madisonian constitutionalism rejects this approach due to a different set of priorities. For the sake of the separation of powers, for the sake of liberty, for the sake of good government, the meaning of elections and the translation of the people's will should be really complicated. It's something that has to be worked out in debate, in deliberation, in negotiation, and ultimately in compromise. It's not something that is finalized with election results. It's something that has to be worked through in the process of government. And that's how Madison thinks that we will get the best policy outcomes and a free government. Okay, so here's what I think, if I could summarize what I think is at stake with this perspective. And I'll close with this. When a president or another elected official claims a mandate for a certain policy or action, we should not begin with the question, did the American people actually vote for this? Or did the American people actually deliver this mandate? Instead, we should proceed through the following set of questions that I've already touched upon throughout my remarks. So first, did the American people authorize the proposed policy or executive action in the Constitution? Or did the American people perhaps even prohibit that action or policy by some part of the Constitution? Second, and a bit more specifically, did the American people in the Constitution allocate the authority to adopt such a policy to the federal government? Or did they reserve that authority to the people within their respective state communities? Third, does the claimed mandate really reflect or embody the cool and deliberate sense, the settled judgment, the settled opinion of the American people? Or is it possibly the product of a more transient impulse or opinion? And finally, with respect to any claimed mandate, have the American people spoken with a clear, unified voice at all on an issue? That's often doubtful, as we noted already, and indeed, the Constitution is designed in some ways to make that unlikely. But where does that leave us if the American people have not spoken in a clear, undeniable, unified voice? Where does that leave us? I think it leaves us with the really hard but worthwhile work of constitutional politics. American constitutionalism was intended to do so much more than to facilitate clear, straightforward electoral mandates. That can be frustrating, it can be messy, it can be slow, it can lead to inaction or compromises that we find regrettable. But Madison's thought encourages us to consider the constitutional benefits that we might reap in exchange for those political costs. And if we better understand the aspirations of the Constitution, we as citizens will be better equipped to do our part to help the Constitution to achieve those aspirations. So thank you very much for your attention. Professor Voverl has given me the authority to take my own questions.
11 minutes for questions.
Okay. Yes. Yeah.
So every election we see a lot of claims thrown from both sides about, this majority faction is taking over, but specifically with this election, with the Trump administration, we're seeing a lot of political scientists and people saying that there's a lot of talk of a type of monarchical type of government overpowering. Is this a true observation? And if it is, how is this possible with the system meant to not allow that?
Yeah, so I think the concern, and hundreds of years, we're coming up on the 250th birthday of the United States, and even this far away from our conflict with King George, it is still very effective to use the language of monarchy as a way of criticizing exercises of executive power. I think what that concern is expressing is that the separation of powers system has become imbalanced in favor of executive power. And that is something that has been a concern not since President Trump was elected in 2024, or even since President Trump was elected in 2016, but this is a much longer developing phenomenon in American politics, that the president is claiming more power, exercising more power than was originally intended in our constitutional framework. Is that happening? Yes, the executive continues to consolidate power. Why is it happening? That probably has a very complicated answer, but I'll give one answer that I've been thinking a lot about recently. And that is, if you read Federalist 51, Madison says that famously, this is the "If Men Were Angels" passage, he famously says that we need to make ambition counter ambition, that if we give the members of the different branches the ambitions to stand up for their branch, that's how you sustain a separation of power system, by ambition checking ambition. And he puts it differently in Federalist 51 by saying that we need to give members of each branch the constitutional means and the personal motives to resist encroachments by the other branches. I think we arguably lack the personal motives today for, say, Congress to stand up to the executive branch when necessary. And there are two reasons that there are two reasons that come to mind for why we lack the personal motives. One reason is that our officials in Congress, I do not think, identify themselves or identify their ambitions with their branch today. They identify their ambitions, they identify themselves with their political parties more than the branch of which they are a part. So it would be surprising except maybe in rare instances, to see a member of Congress stand up and say, I, as a senator, am going to defend the prerogatives of the Senate. And it doesn't matter if this president is a member of my political party. It doesn't matter if this president is pursuing a policy that I think would be preferable, but I have an interest in defending the prerogatives of the Senate. So I'm not going to let this executive action stand without a fight because I don't think the president has the authority to do it. So I think that's one reason, is that we arguably lack the personal motives because of the partisan impulses of our elected officials. But one thing I have been thinking a lot about lately, and I think it's important to emphasize, is that one of the best ways to give an elected official the personal motive to want to stand up for the separation of powers would be if voters were going to punish an elected official for not standing up for the separation of powers. So if citizens take it upon themselves to say, this is a priority for us, and setting aside policy concerns, setting aside the partisan struggles that we have, we as voters will hold you accountable if you don't seem to be faithfully standing up for the separation of powers. That would be a strong personal motive, since elected officials are driven by the desire for re-election. So those would be two preliminary thoughts, that the personal motives in Congress are lacking. Another way of describing that I've heard others mention, another lacking personal motive, or even the inverse of a personal motive that would contribute to the preservation of the separation of powers, is that it's convenient for Congress to let the president handle lots of things. So rather than having the ambition to hold on to their power, it might be more preferable for them to let somebody else handle the work of government that was originally allocated to them. So that's yet another way in which they may lack the personal motives to preserve the right distribution of power. Yes?
In Madison appears that, with regard to the three aspects of the Constitution, of federalism, separation of powers, and choice of representation, we recognize it. And if not, I mean, how do you think about how his Constitution is working today?
Yes, so you said federalism, the separation of powers, and the purpose of representation. Yes. That's always a tricky question of, like, what would the founders think today? And it's often met with a sort of joke about, like, they would be so distracted by technology or airplanes or something that they wouldn't be thinking about the type of question that you just asked. I think he would be deeply concerned about each one. That he would be concerned that the system had not been maintained as he had originally envisioned it. Now, he may accept some of the reasons for that having been the case with certain historical developments, but I think with respect to representation, what we've seen is less an institutional change than I think what we could describe as a cultural change. That senators still have 6-year terms. 6-year terms were designed for them to have some space from public pressure so that they can make long-term policy choices that may not be immediately popular, but they could hopefully show to their constituents that they are worthy of approval by the time their 6-year term is up. We still have those. We still have the staggered elections in the Senate, that the Senate is built for stability, so that no matter how much the American people want to turn the entire government upside down in any election, they can do that in the House. Everybody's up for election in the House. Every 4 years, they can switch over the executive administration, but they're limited to only changing a third of the Senate every 2 years. So that's still there. But I think, you can make the case that culturally we have changed our perception of what a representative is supposed to be. So with respect to the separation of powers and federalism, there's a lot of politics, there's a lot of jurisprudence that has accumulated over time to shift away from what Madison's vision would be. With respect to representation, there's been a cultural shift away from what Madison was hoping representatives would serve the function of. Yeah.
Thank you. Considering you said that the Senate is supposed to be the stabilizing branch of the legislative branch, would you say that the 17th Amendment, which made the Senate
I'm not sure how much. Theoretically speaking, it would have a significant effect, because one of the benefits of indirect election of senators was not only to reinforce federalism, because state legislatures would have a direct control over who their federal senators were, but the indirectness of the election was also supposed to have a refining effect, that the people will choose qualified state legislators, and then those state legislators, with their experience and their political information, that they will choose even more impressive, even more qualified senators. So possibly, that has possibly had a negative effect on the quality of senators that we have, and also the way senators see themselves. Senators see themselves as very much, they are directly elected, so they directly engage with voters now. But a potentially bigger problem is that senators see their role as a senator as serving other purposes, as serving their future political ambitions, or as serving their political celebrity. And whether that's connected to the 17th Amendment, I'm not sure that we can make a really strong case that is the cause of why senators see themselves in that way. Yes?
Given the divided state of the country in the modern day, would you say that a simple electoral victory plus a popular vote victory would equal a mandate from the people, like some pundits in the media claim?
Well, let me start by saying that I think it's very difficult to make a mandate claim if you've lost one of those two things. If you've lost the Electoral College, then you haven't even won the election. You haven't won by the rules of the game. If you've lost the popular vote, then more Americans voted against you than for you. So I think that makes mandate claims really difficult to defend in those contexts. I also think that it's difficult to make a strong case that you have a mandate when you only win a plurality of the vote. So when you do not win, even if you as the victorious candidate win more votes than anyone else, but because some votes are for third-party candidates or for write-in candidates, if you as the winning candidate win less than a majority of the vote, I think it's difficult to say that you have a mandate when most Americans who voted chose someone else rather than you, even though you won the election. But so your question was, if you do win the Electoral College and you win a majority of the popular vote, I think you said a majority of the popular vote, would you have a mandate? Maybe, but I don't think it's clear at all what that mandate would consist of. You have power. You now have all of the constitutional authority that attaches to the President of the United States. You have all of the responsibilities that attach to the President of the United States. But I don't think it's clear, even if you win a majority of the vote, that you have any particular mandate to govern. Especially if you barely won the majority, then it means that almost half the country voted for someone else. But we also know that there are very complicated reasons that different people have for who they vote for. So to say, I ran on this position, on this policy, I said that's what I believe in, and then the people elected me, so therefore I have a mandate to carry out what I said during the campaign. Well, people voted for you for all sorts of reasons, and it's not clear that you have a mandate for that particular policy aim of yours.